Hello everyone, and welcome back to Sleepless Campfire. Tonight, we travel into the forgotten backroads of America, places where light fades, and what remains are stories that refuse to die. Across these hills, rivers, and empty towns are accounts drawn from witness reports, police files, and archived broadcasts. Each one verified, recorded, and retold in their own words. Now, let us begin with our first story. It was early April of 2015 when Dr. Rebecca Nakamura first noticed the unusual rock formations in a remote section of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The 41-year-old geologist had been conducting a survey of mineral deposits in the region for a mining company, using ground-penetrating radar and other specialized equipment to map the geological composition of the area. Rebecca had spent 15 years studying the complex geological history of the Appalachian Mountains, earning recognition in her field for her groundbreaking research on metamorphic processes and mineral formation under extreme conditions. The mining company, Terra Nova Resources, had specifically recruited her for this expedition, due to her expertise in identifying rare earth elements and her reputation for meticulous fieldwork. What began as a routine mineral survey would soon become the most profound and unsettling discovery of her career. The journey to the remote valley had been challenging, requiring 4 days of hiking through increasingly rugged terrain. Rebecca had been accompanied by 2 guides from a local outfitter who had left her at the edge of the valley with supplies for a week-long solo expedition. As she set up her temporary base camp, Rebecca immediately sensed that this place was different from anywhere she had been before. The air in the valley felt heavier, charged with an energy that she could almost feel on her skin. She noted in her field journal that the usual sounds of the forest were absent, replaced by a profound silence that seemed to absorb even the sound of her own movements. It was as if the valley existed in a pocket of reality, where the normal rules of acoustics did not apply. The rock formations that had drawn her attention were unlike anything she had encountered in her 15 years of geological research. They appeared to be arranged in deliberate patterns, forming geometric shapes that seemed too precise to be the result of natural processes. Some formations created perfect spirals that extended for 50 feet or more, with stones of varying sizes arranged in mathematical ratios that corresponded to the golden ratio. Others formed concentric circles, with stones decreasing in size at precise intervals, creating patterns that resembled ripples in a pond. What most disturbed Rebecca was the realization that these formations appeared to be part of a larger, more complex design that spanned the entire valley. As she began her survey, using the ground-penetrating radar, Rebecca discovered structures beneath the surface that appeared to be artificial in nature, forming what looked like chambers and tunnels extending deep into the bedrock. The radar images showed geometric shapes with perfect angles and smooth surfaces that contradicted everything she knew about natural geological formations. Most puzzling was the fact that these structures did not appear on any geological surveys of the area, despite the region having been studied extensively by geologists for over a century. Rebecca cross-referenced her findings with historical maps and survey reports, confirming that no previous expedition had documented these underground structures. By the second day, Rebecca had documented several dozen of the unusual rock formations, each one different, yet clearly part of a larger, more complex design. Some were arranged in spirals, others in concentric circles, and still others formed what appeared to be representations of celestial bodies, including constellations that would not be visible from Earth for thousands of years. The composition of the rocks themselves was equally puzzling. They contained minerals and isotopes that should not have been present in this geological formation, suggesting either an error in previous understanding of the region's geological history, or the possibility that the rocks had been brought to this location from elsewhere. Rebecca collected samples for later analysis, using her portable spectrometer to identify elements that contradicted the known geological history of the Appalachian Mountains. She found traces of iridium and osmium in concentrations that should not exist in this region, along with isotopic ratios that suggested some of the rocks were billions of years older than the surrounding geological formations. As a scientist, Rebecca tried to rationalize these findings, considering various explanations such as meteorite impacts or unknown volcanic activity. But none of these theories could account for the precise arrangement of the formations or the artificial structures detected by her ground-penetrating radar. That evening, as Rebecca reviewed her data in her tent, she felt a growing sense of unease mixed with scientific excitement. She had devoted her career to understanding the geological processes that shaped the Earth. But what she had discovered in this valley challenged the fundamental principles of her field. The formations appeared to be both ancient and precise, suggesting an intelligence that had existed long before human civilization had developed the mathematical and scientific knowledge necessary to create such designs. Rebecca found herself oscillating between skepticism and wonder, her scientific training warring with the evidence before her eyes. On the third day, Rebecca made a discovery that would challenge her understanding of geology and history. While excavating around one of the larger formations, she uncovered what appeared to be a carved stone tablet, approximately 2 feet by 3 feet in size, covered in symbols that resembled a combination of petroglyphs and mathematical equations. The tablet was made of a dark, crystalline material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating an impression of depth that was almost hypnotic. As she carefully cleared away the dirt surrounding the tablet, Rebecca noticed that the symbols seemed to change when viewed from different angles, as if they were three-dimensional representations of complex concepts rather than simple two-dimensional carvings. Rebecca photographed the tablet from multiple angles, documenting how the symbols shifted and reformed with each change in perspective. Some symbols resembled ancient petroglyphs she had seen in textbooks, while others looked like advanced mathematical equations or molecular diagrams. What disturbed her most was the realization that some of the symbols matched those used in advanced theoretical physics, particularly those related to quantum mechanics and multidimensional space-time. As a geologist, Rebecca had only a basic understanding of these concepts, but she recognized enough to know that they represented scientific knowledge that humanity had only begun to develop in the past century. That evening, as Rebecca was documenting her discovery in her field journal, she became aware of a presence in the valley. It was not something she could see or hear directly, but rather a feeling of being observed by an intelligence that was ancient and vast. The air grew heavy and charged with static electricity, making her hair stand on end despite the mild temperature. She looked up from her journal to see a figure standing at the edge of her campsite, a tall, slender being that seemed to be made of the same stone as the formations she had been studying. The figure was approximately 8 feet tall, with a form that suggested both masculinity and femininity, or perhaps neither. Its surface appeared to be composed of the same dark, crystalline material as the tablet, with symbols that shifted and changed as Rebecca watched. The figure did not move or speak, but Rebecca suddenly understood that she had been allowed to discover this place because she had the knowledge to appreciate its significance, but that she was now expected to leave and never return. This understanding came not through words, but through a direct transmission of knowledge that bypassed language and conscious thought, implanting itself in her mind with the certainty of a mathematical proof. Rebecca felt a mixture of terror and awe as she confronted this being that defied her understanding of biology and physics. She wanted to ask questions, to document, to understand. But she knew that this was not an encounter that could be analyzed with her scientific tools. The being seemed to exist outside of time, as she understood it, simultaneously ancient and immediate, physical and ethereal. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few minutes, the figure slowly dissolved back into the surrounding rocks, leaving Rebecca alone in the valley with her thoughts and the profound implications of what she had experienced. Rebecca packed her equipment the next morning, leaving the stone tablet where she had found it, but taking extensive photographs and detailed notes. As she prepared to leave the valley, she noticed that the formations seemed to have shifted overnight, creating new patterns that were even more complex and precise than those she had documented previously. Some spirals had tightened, some circles had expanded, and new formations had appeared that had not been there the day before. Rebecca took additional photographs, though she suspected that they would not capture the true nature of these changes. She took one last look around the valley, feeling a sense of awe mixed with profound unease, then began the long hike back to civilization. When she reached her vehicle, she was surprised to find that nearly a week had passed since she had entered the valley, though she remembered only 3 days and nights. Her watch and other electronic devices had stopped working, and she had no memory of the missing time. It was as if she had stepped outside of normal time during her encounter with the stone being, returning to find that the world had continued without her. In the months that followed, Rebecca struggled to make sense of what she had experienced. The rock samples she had collected defied analysis, showing properties that contradicted established geological principles. Some samples appeared to change in composition when observed under different conditions, as if their molecular structure was not fixed, but responsive to observation. The photographs of the formations and the stone tablet were strangely distorted, as if they had been taken through a lens that somehow bent both light and time. In some images, the formations appeared to be in motion, though Rebecca had no memory of seeing them move. Rebecca's professional reputation suffered as she attempted to share her findings with colleagues. Most dismissed her observations as hallucinations or misinterpretations of natural phenomena. A few suggested that she might be experiencing psychological stress from working in isolation. The mining company that had hired her expressed disappointment with her report, which contained no valuable information about mineral deposits, but instead described formations and phenomena that they considered irrelevant to their commercial interests. Eventually, Rebecca published a paper about her discovery in a specialized geological journal, presenting her findings as theoretical models rather than actual observations to avoid professional ridicule. She framed her work as a speculative exploration of hypothetical geological formations that might exist under certain rare conditions, using mathematical models to describe patterns that she had actually observed in the valley. The paper received little attention from the mainstream geological community, though a few physicists and mathematicians noted the elegance of her models without recognizing their empirical basis. In a private letter to a trusted colleague written several years later, Rebecca confided, "I found a place that doesn't belong to our time or understanding of reality. The formations weren't just rocks. They were a library of knowledge left by something that existed long before humanity and will likely exist long after we're gone. Sometimes I wonder if the missing time was spent learning things I can't remember, or if I was simply allowed to glimpse a truth that human minds aren't meant to hold." Rebecca never returned to the valley, though she often thought about the stone tablet and the beings she had encountered there. She continued her work as a geologist, but her perspective had fundamentally changed. She saw the Earth not just as a collection of rocks and minerals, but as a repository of knowledge that extended far beyond human history. Sometimes, when looking at rock formations in other parts of the world, she thought she could see patterns similar to those in the valley, though she could never prove this to anyone else's satisfaction. Years after her discovery, Rebecca sometimes wondered about the nature of the intelligence she had encountered. Was it an alien civilization that had visited Earth in the distant past? A form of life that had evolved alongside humanity but remained hidden? Or something even more mysterious, a consciousness that emerged from the Earth itself, expressing itself through geological processes? She had no answers, only questions that continued to haunt her scientific research and her dreams. The experience had changed Rebecca in ways that she was still trying to understand. She had always been a scientist who believed in observable, measurable phenomena. But now she accepted that some aspects of reality might exist beyond the reach of current scientific methods. She had glimpsed a truth that was both terrifying and beautiful, that the universe was far older, stranger, and more complex than humanity could imagine, and that humans were not the only, or perhaps even the most important intelligence to have called Earth home. 300 miles south of Kaktovik, Officer Rachel Nez had established herself as one of the most reliable members of the Kaktovik Pass Police Department. A former Navajo tribal police officer like Begay, she had been drawn to Alaska by the same recruitment program that had brought her colleague north. Unlike Begay, however, Nez had embraced the Arctic landscape, finding in its stark beauty a connection to the high desert plateaus of her homeland. Born in Kayenta, Arizona, Nez had grown up hearing stories from her grandmother about the ancient ones who walked between worlds, tales that had fascinated her since childhood. Her decision to pursue law enforcement had been influenced by these stories. She believed that maintaining balance in the community was a sacred duty. Whether that community was in the red rock canyons of Arizona or the frozen tundra of Alaska. Her expertise in cold weather survival had made her invaluable during the harsh winter months, and her calm demeanor had helped de-escalate numerous potentially dangerous situations in the remote village. It was precisely these qualities that led the department to assign her as the permanent officer at the abandoned Cold War listening post at Chandalar Shelf, a facility that had been reopened in 2016 as a forward research station for studying climate change effects on permafrost. The listening post, originally constructed in the 1950s as part of the distant early warning line, consisted of 3 interconnected buildings buried beneath the snow for insulation against the extreme temperatures. The main structure, a windowless concrete bunker, housed the living quarters and research facilities, while 2 smaller outbuildings contained power generation equipment and storage. The entire complex was connected by underground tunnels, allowing movement between buildings without exposure to the elements. Nez's assignment was to maintain a police presence at the facility, which housed a rotating team of 5 researchers who collected data on the thawing permafrost. The team was led by Dr. Marcus Chen, a glaciologist from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, who had spent 20 years studying Arctic ice formations. His colleagues included a geologist, a biologist, and 2 graduate students who were conducting long-term research on the effects of climate change on Arctic ecosystems. Nez's duties were routine: daily equipment checks, perimeter patrols, and maintaining communication with the main department in Kaktovik Pass. The isolation suited her nature, and she had developed a comfortable rhythm to her days, marked by the changing quality of light through the polar seasons. She had converted a small storage room in the main building into an office, where she kept her patrol logs and equipment. The room was Spartan but functional, with a metal desk, a filing cabinet, and a communications console that connected her to the outside world. On the wall, she had hung a single photograph of her family in Arizona, a reminder of the world that existed beyond the endless white landscape that surrounded her. The researchers had come to appreciate her quiet presence, often seeking her company during evening meals in the communal dining area where they would share stories and observations from their respective fields. On March 12, 2017, during the spring equinox, when day and night were briefly equal, Nez documented in her patrol log the first of several unusual occurrences that would culminate in an incident still discussed in hushed tones among Alaskan law enforcement. It began with what the researchers described as acoustic anomalies, unexplained sounds that seemed to emanate from the permafrost beneath the facility. Nez initially dismissed these as the normal groans and shifts of the frozen ground. But as the days passed, the sounds developed patterns that defied geological explanation. They occurred at precise intervals, every 2 hours and 17 minutes, and lasted exactly 3 minutes and 42 seconds. The sound itself was difficult to describe, variously characterized as a low humming, a distant chanting, or the whisper of many voices speaking simultaneously in an unknown language. Nez, with her Navajo heritage, was the first to recognize elements in the vocalizations that resembled certain ceremonial chants, though distorted and layered in ways that human vocal cords could not produce. She recorded several sessions on her department-issued audio equipment, creating files that would later stump audio analysts at the Alaska State Troopers headquarters. The recordings captured a complex pattern of frequencies that seemed to shift in response to environmental conditions, becoming clearer during periods of low atmospheric pressure and more distorted when storms moved through the area. Dr. Chen and his team were baffled by the phenomenon, initially attributing it to some unknown geological process. But as the days passed, even they had to admit that the sounds exhibited a complexity that suggested intelligence rather than natural occurrence. The escalating phenomena took a more tangible form on March 27th, when Nez discovered a series of unusual formations outside the facility's main entrance. These were not the typical ice formations created by wind and temperature fluctuations, but intricate, symmetrical patterns resembling the sand paintings used in certain Navajo healing ceremonies. Each morning for 5 consecutive days, a new formation would appear, despite no footprints in the fresh snow other than Nez's own and the researchers. The formations contained symbols that Nez recognized from her cultural education, specifically those associated with the Anasazi, the ancient ancestors of the Navajo people. What troubled her most was that these particular symbols were related to stories of the people who lived in the cold places before the world changed, a reference that had never been fully explained in the oral traditions she had learned. Nez photographed each formation, documenting their precise measurements and orientations. She noticed that the patterns changed slightly each day, as if they were telling a story or conveying a message. The symbols included representations of constellations that were only visible in the Arctic sky, as well as geometric patterns that resembled the molecular structure of ice crystals. Dr. Chen, when shown the photographs, admitted that he had never seen natural ice formations with such precision and complexity. The graduate students, meanwhile, were fascinated by the cultural elements. Spending hours in the facility's small library researching Arctic indigenous peoples and their traditions, Nez found herself increasingly drawn to the formations, feeling a strange connection to them that she couldn't quite explain, a sense that they were meant specifically for her to understand. As the days passed, Nez began to experience a growing sense of unease that she struggled to articulate in her patrol logs. She found herself waking at precisely 2:17 a.m. each night, just minutes before the acoustic anomalies began. During these waking periods, she would sit in her office with the lights off, listening to the strange sounds emanating from beneath the facility and trying to decipher their meaning. She began to recall stories her grandmother had told her about the Yeitso ancient beings who were said to inhabit the cold places of the world and who could communicate with humans through symbols and sounds. These stories, which she had dismissed as childhood fantasies, now seemed to take on new significance in the context of what she was experiencing at the listening post. The situation reached its apex on April 2nd, when the research team's seismic equipment detected movement beneath the facility at precisely 3:17 a.m., the same time as one of the acoustic events. Nez, responding to the researchers' alarmed calls, entered the lower level of the main building to find that a section of the permafrost wall had receded, revealing an opening approximately 6 feet high and 3 feet wide. The cavity beyond was not natural, but appeared to be a tunnel, its walls smooth as if carved by tools. From within came the now familiar chanting sound, louder and clearer than ever before. As Nez approached the opening with her flashlight and weapon drawn, she saw movement in the darkness, small figures that moved with impossible speed, their forms briefly illuminated before disappearing into the shadows. Her radio, which had been functioning perfectly moments before, emitted only static when she attempted to call for backup. Nez stood frozen in the doorway, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness of the tunnel. The figures she had glimpsed were unlike anything she had ever seen, smaller than human children, with elongated limbs and movements that defied normal biomechanics. They seemed to phase in and out of visibility, appearing for brief moments as silhouettes against the deeper darkness of the tunnel before vanishing again. The chanting sound grew louder as she watched, resolving into distinct voices that spoke in a language she couldn't understand. But that felt strangely familiar, as if she had heard it in dreams long forgotten. Despite her training and the instinct to retreat, Nez felt compelled to move forward, drawn by a curiosity that overrode her fear. As she stepped into the tunnel, the air grew noticeably warmer, and the walls seemed to emit a faint bluish light that illuminated her path. The chanting now seemed to come from all around her, echoing in a way that suggested the tunnel was larger than it appeared from the entrance. Nez advanced slowly, her weapon held ready but her finger relaxed on the trigger. She could now see markings on the walls, symbols similar to those in the ice formations outside, but more complex and detailed. These seemed to tell a story, though she could only interpret fragments. Figures emerging from beneath the ice, traveling across the sky, and returning to the cold places. The deeper she went into the tunnel, the more convinced she became that she was walking through a passage between worlds, a concept her grandmother had spoken of, but which she had never fully understood until now. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably no more than 10 minutes, Nez reached a chamber where the tunnel widened into a circular space approximately 20 feet in diameter. The walls of this chamber were covered with intricate carvings that depicted what appeared to be star maps, though the constellations were unlike any she had seen in either the Arctic or Arizona skies. In the center of the chamber stood a stone altar, upon which rested several objects that appeared to be artifacts of some kind, smooth stones carved with symbols, crystalline structures that emitted their own light, and what looked like tools made from unknown metals. As Nez approached the altar, the chanting intensified, and she became aware of figures standing in the shadows around the perimeter of the chamber. These figures were more clearly visible now, though still difficult to focus on, as if they existed in a different dimension of reality. They were tall and slender, with features that were vaguely humanoid, but distinctly otherworldly. They wore no clothing that Nez could discern, but their bodies seemed to be covered in patterns that shifted and changed like the aurora in the night sky. One of them stepped forward, raising a hand in a gesture that Nez understood to be peaceful despite having no frame of reference for their communication. The figure spoke, and though the words were in a language she didn't know, Nez found that she understood the meaning, a greeting, and welcome, and an invitation to learn. What followed was an experience that Nez would later struggle to put into words, a communication that transcended language and occurred directly in her consciousness. The beings, who identified themselves as the ancient ones who dwell in the cold places, showed her images of their world, a place of eternal twilight, where ice and rock formed living landscapes that responded to thought and emotion. They explained that they had been observing humanity for millennia, occasionally making contact with those who were receptive to their presence. They had chosen to reveal themselves to her because of her unique heritage, a combination of Navajo traditions that acknowledged the existence of other worlds and her current position in a place where the veil between dimensions was particularly thin. The beings showed Nez visions of Earth's past, of times when their world and hers had been more closely connected. They spoke of a great catastrophe that had separated their dimensions, forcing them to retreat into the cold places where the boundaries between worlds remained permeable. They explained that the melting of the permafrost due to climate change was creating new passages between their worlds, passages that they were cautiously exploring. The acoustic anomalies and ice formations were their attempts to communicate, to establish contact before revealing themselves fully. They meant no harm, they assured her, but were curious about humanity and concerned about the changes occurring in both their world and hers. As this communication was taking place, Nez became aware of a growing sense of urgency among the beings. They explained that the tunnel she had entered was becoming unstable, that the dimensional passage was closing. They urged her to return to her world before it was too late, but not before offering her a gift, a small crystalline object that felt warm to the touch and seemed to contain a light of its own. As Nez took the object, the chamber began to fade, the chanting grew softer, and the figures became less distinct. She found herself moving back through the tunnel, the crystalline object clutched in her hand, her mind reeling from the experience. When Nez emerged from the tunnel, she found Dr. Chen and the two graduate students standing in the corridor, their faces pale with concern. The opening in the permafrost wall was gone, with no indication that it had ever existed. Nez's radio crackled to life, the voice of her dispatcher from Kaktovik Pass asking if she was okay, responding to a report of equipment malfunction at the research station. As Nez tried to explain what had happened, she realized that the crystalline object was no longer in her hand. It had vanished, as if it had never existed. The only evidence of her experience was the memory, vivid and undeniable, but impossible to prove. The official response was swift and comprehensive. Within 4 hours, a team from the Alaska State Troopers arrived via helicopter, accompanied by a geologist and an archaeologist from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. They found Nez in a state of shock, but physically unharmed, sitting in the facility's common area and repeatedly describing what she had seen. The tunnel she had discovered had vanished, the walls showing no signs of the opening she had reported. The seismic equipment had inexplicably failed during the time in question, with no data saved from the early morning hours. The audio recordings Nez had made were corrupted beyond recovery, showing only waveforms that audio experts later described as statistically impossible in natural acoustic phenomena. The case file, AST 2017-0402, remains open, with periodic follow-ups that have yielded no additional explanations. The investigation that followed was thorough but inconclusive. The geologist conducted extensive tests on the permafrost wall, where Nez had reported the opening, finding no evidence of any disturbance or unusual activity. The archaeologist, meanwhile, was fascinated by Nez's description of the symbols in the tunnel, noting their similarity to petroglyphs found in various locations around the world, but could offer no explanation for how they might have appeared in a government research facility in Alaska. Dr. Chen and his team were interviewed separately, each confirming that they had witnessed the seismic activity and heard Nez's call for backup, though none of them had seen or heard anything unusual beyond that. The official report, filed 3 weeks after the incident, concluded that Officer Nez had probably experienced a hallucination brought on by stress and isolation, though it acknowledged that certain aspects of the incident remained unexplained. Nez requested and received a transfer back to the Southwest 6 months after the incident, where she reportedly continues to experience occasional episodes of unexplained hearing loss in her right ear. She returned to the Navajo Nation, where she now works as a cultural liaison between tribal authorities and federal law enforcement agencies. Those who know her say she has changed quieter, more introspective, as if she carries knowledge that most people will never understand. She rarely speaks of her experience at the Chandalar Shelf listening post, but when she does, she describes it not as something frightening, but as something transformative, a glimpse into a reality that exists alongside our own. Normally invisible, but occasionally accessible to those who know how to look. No trace was ever found of the tunnel Nez described, the beings she encountered, or the crystalline object they offered her. The listening post at Chandalar Shelf continued to operate for another 2 years before being closed due to budget cuts. The acoustic anomalies ceased after April 2, 2017, and no further ice formations appeared outside the facility. The case remains one of the most puzzling in the history of the Alaska State Troopers, filed away among other unexplained phenomena that defy conventional explanation. For Rachel Nez, however, the experience was not an anomaly to be explained, but a revelation to be integrated, a reminder that the world is more complex and mysterious than most people realize, and that there are still places where the veil between dimensions grows thin, allowing glimpses of what lies beyond. Hundreds of miles away in the village of Kaktovik, Officer Samuel Yazzie was beginning his 3rd year with the North Slope Borough Police Department. Like Begay and Nez before him, Yazzie had come to Alaska through the Tribal Exchange Program, bringing with him 15 years of experience with the Navajo Tribal Police and a reputation for solving cases that had stumped other investigators. His assignment to Kaktovik, the only permanent settlement within the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, was meant to be a relatively quiet posting, a place where his expertise could be shared with a small local police force, while he enjoyed a semi-retirement from the more demanding aspects of law enforcement. The village, with its population of just over 200 people, sat on Barter Island, a 16-mile-long stretch of land surrounded by the Beaufort Sea. For Yazzie, the isolation and close-knit community reminded him of the remote chapters of the Navajo Nation where he had begun his career. The autumn of 2018 brought unusual weather patterns to the region, with unseasonably warm temperatures creating a thick layer of fog that persisted for weeks, limiting visibility and complicating travel between the village and the mainland. It was during this period that Yazzie received a call from a concerned research team at the Kaktovik Weather Station, who reported that one of their colleagues, Dr. Eleanor Whitman, had missed her scheduled radio check-in for the 3rd consecutive day. The weather station, located 5 miles outside the village, was accessible only by a rough gravel road that became treacherous in the persistent fog. Yazzie organized a search party consisting of himself, 2 local volunteers, and a team of 4 wildlife biologists who were studying polar bear denning patterns in the area. What they discovered at the weather station would become one of the most baffling missing person cases in Alaskan history. The station appeared undisturbed from the outside, with all doors and windows secured and no signs of forced entry. Inside, Yazzie found Dr. Whitman's research materials neatly organized on her desk, her computer still running with a half-completed weather analysis on the screen. Her personal belongings were in her quarters, and her vehicle was parked in its designated spot with a full tank of fuel. The only thing out of place was a series of strange symbols drawn in the condensation on the interior of several windows, geometric patterns that Yazzie immediately recognized from his cultural training as elements of Navajo star charts, specifically those related to the constellation known in Diné as the Revolving Male, the Big Dipper, More disturbing was the discovery that all timekeeping devices in the station, digital clocks, analog watches, and even the battery-powered backup systems had stopped at precisely 11:47 p.m. on the night of Dr. Whitman's last radio transmission. The search expanded over the following days, with additional resources brought in from Fairbanks, including a specialized search and rescue team with ground-penetrating radar equipment. They conducted an exhaustive search of the surrounding tundra, finding no footprints or other signs of Dr. Whitman's passage in the rapidly accumulating snow. The ground-penetrating radar revealed numerous anomalies beneath the permafrost. But excavation was impossible due to the approaching winter and the deteriorating weather conditions. The most significant discovery came on the 5th day of the search, when one of the wildlife biologists noticed a series of unusual tracks near the station's satellite dish. The tracks did not belong to any known Arctic species and were described in the official report as resembling human footprints, but with an abnormal stride length of approximately 7 feet and a depth inconsistent with the weight of a human of average size. The investigation took a bizarre turn when Yazzie reviewed the station's security footage, which had been backed up to a cloud server minutes before the timekeeping devices stopped. The final segment, time-stamped 11:46 p.m., showed Dr. Whitman standing at the window, apparently observing something outside. As Yazzie enhanced the image, he could see that she was tracing patterns on the glass identical to those he had found days later. What chilled him to the bone was what happened next. The lights in the station flickered, and for approximately 3 seconds, a figure appeared behind Dr. Whitman, a tall, slender entity that seemed to phase in and out of existence. The figure was humanoid, but elongated, with proportions that defied human anatomy. When the lights stabilized, both Dr. Whitman and the figure were gone, though the door remained closed and locked from the inside. The Alaska State Troopers took over the investigation on October 17, 2018, designating it Case Durstwash AST 2018-10-12. Despite extensive efforts, including aerial searches with thermal imaging equipment and interviews with everyone in the remote village, no trace of Dr. Eleanor Whitman has ever been found. The security footage was analyzed by experts at the FBI's crime laboratory, who concluded that while the recording appeared authentic, they could not explain the anomalous figure or the disappearance. Yazzie submitted a supplementary report detailing the similarities between the symbols at the weather station and traditional Navajo astronomical knowledge, suggesting a possible connection to the other unexplained incidents involving former Navajo tribal police officers in Alaska. His report was filed without comment from his superiors, and the case remains officially unsolved. Yazzie retired from law enforcement 6 months after the investigation concluded, returning to Arizona, where he now lives in self-imposed isolation on the western edge of the Navajo Nation. No trace was ever found. In the communications center of the Alaska State Troopers headquarters in Fairbanks, Sergeant Linda Tso monitored the network of radio frequencies that connected the scattered outposts across the vast Northern Territory. A 20-year veteran of the Alaska State Troopers with a previous decade of service in the Navajo Nation Police Department, Tso had developed an almost preternatural ability to distinguish between routine transmissions and those that signaled something out of the ordinary. Her workstation, positioned against the wall of monitors displaying real-time data from weather stations, research facilities, and patrol vehicles across the North Slope, was her domain, a place where she had become the human nexus of information flow across an area larger than many states. It was precisely this expertise that made her the first to recognize the pattern in the anomalous broadcasts that began in January 2019. The first incident occurred at 2:13 a.m. on January 7th, when a distress call came through on the emergency frequency reserved for the research station at Cape Lisburne. The transmission was fragmented, with bursts of static obscuring most of the message. But what came through clearly was a voice speaking in Navajo, a language that should not have been in use at the remote facility, whose staff consisted entirely of climatologists from various universities in the lower 48 states. Tso, who was fluent in the language, understood enough to recognize that the speaker was reciting portions of the creation story, specifically the section describing the emergence of the people into the fourth world. Before she could respond or attempt to trace the call, the transmission ended abruptly, replaced by the high-pitched whine of feedback that continued for exactly 47 seconds before ceasing. Tso logged the incident as a probable equipment malfunction, though she noted in her private journal that unease had settled over her like a shroud. Similar transmissions continued over the following weeks, always occurring between 2 and 3 a.m., always originating from different remote facilities across the North Slope, and always containing fragments of Navajo ceremonial language. Tso began to map the occurrences, discovering that they formed a pattern when plotted on the regional map, a spiral that seemed to center on the abandoned DW line station at Point Barrow, the same location where Officer Begay had received his mysterious transmission 5 years earlier. What disturbed her most was that each facility reported no knowledge of the broadcasts. With all personnel accounted for and no record of anyone accessing their communication equipment during the times in question, the technical teams dispatched to inspect the equipment found no evidence of tampering or external connections, with each system functioning perfectly during diagnostic tests. The situation escalated on February 14th, when Tso received a direct transmission on her personal frequency, a channel that was not listed in any official directory and was known only to a handful of senior officers. The voice that spoke was different from the previous broadcasts, clearer, more deliberate, and speaking in perfect English with what Tso identified as a traditional Diné accent from the Chinle area of Arizona. "They are coming through the thin places," the voice said. "The ice is a door, and they have learned to open it. You must not go to the spiral center when the lights dance in the sky." The transmission lasted only 17 seconds before dissolving into static. But it was enough to convince Tso that something extraordinary was happening across the Arctic landscape she had come to know so well. She filed an official report, AST 2019-02-14, and requested authorization to investigate the pattern more thoroughly. But her superiors, concerned about the unusual nature of her claims, assigned her to administrative duties pending a psychological evaluation. Undeterred, Tso used her personal time to research the connections between the broadcasts and the earlier incidents involving former Navajo tribal police officers in Alaska. She discovered that all of these officers, Begay, Nez, Yazzie, and herself, were members of the same clan, the Ashihi, Salt people, and had all been born within a 50-mile radius of each other in the Navajo Nation. More disturbingly, she found that each had been recruited to Alaska by the same man, Captain Roger Mitchell, who had retired from the Alaska State Troopers in 2015, but now lived in a remote cabin near Fairbanks. When Tso attempted to contact Mitchell, she discovered that he had been reported missing by his family 3 weeks earlier, with his last known location being the abandoned Dew Line station at Point Barrow, the center of the spiral pattern she had identified in the broadcast locations. The Alaska State Troopers officially closed Tso's investigation on March 30th, 2019, attributing the radio transmissions to a combination of equipment malfunctions, atmospheric phenomena, and possible hoaxes. Her psychological evaluation, conducted by the department's Behavioral Sciences Unit, concluded that while she exhibited no signs of mental illness, she had developed an over-identification with Native American folklore that was affecting her professional judgment. Tso was placed on indefinite administrative leave, with the understanding that she would retire rather than face possible termination. Before leaving her position, she made one final entry in her personal journal, a detailed account of all the strange transmissions, the patterns she had identified, and her growing certainty that something ancient and otherworldly was stirring in the frozen north. The journal disappeared from her locked desk drawer 2 days after her departure. With no sign of forced entry and no record of anyone accessing the communication center during that time. So returned to Arizona, where she now lives in a small community near the Four Corners region, reportedly spending her time documenting traditional stories and ceremonies for the Navajo Nation Museum. No trace was ever found. Dr. Michael Chi, a cultural anthropologist from the University of New Mexico, arrived in Kaktovik in June 2019 with a research grant to study the cultural adaptation of law enforcement officers from tribal nations serving in remote Arctic communities. As a member of the Navajo Nation himself, Chi had a personal interest in understanding how officers from his own culture navigated the challenges of policing in an environment so different from their homeland. His research methodology involved extensive interviews with current and former officers, participant observation during routine patrols, and analysis of departmental policies related to cross-cultural policing. What began as a straightforward academic study would evolve into something far more unsettling, as Chi uncovered patterns that connected several unexplained incidents across the North Slope borough. Chi's first interviews were with current officers who had transferred from tribal police departments in the lower 48 states. Most spoke positively about their experiences, though several mentioned unusual occurrences that they struggled to explain within their professional worldview. One officer, who asked to remain anonymous, described seeing shadow figures moving across the tundra during polar night, forms that were too tall and thin to be human, yet moved with a purpose that suggested intelligence rather than random atmospheric illusions. Another mentioned finding strange tracks in the snow that appeared and disappeared within a single patrol cycle, with no explanation for how they could have formed or vanished so completely. Chi documented these accounts in his field notes, but initially attributed them to the psychological effects of extreme isolation and perpetual darkness during the winter months. As his research progressed, Chi became aware of the earlier incidents involving former Navajo tribal police officers, Begay's discovery at the abandoned whaling station, Nez's experience at the listening post, Yazi's investigation of the missing researcher, and So's documentation of the mysterious broadcasts. He obtained copies of the official reports through Freedom of Information Act requests and began to identify connections that had escaped notice during the original investigations. Most significantly, he discovered that each of these officers had been recruited to Alaska by Captain Roger Mitchell, who had himself disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Chi also noted that each incident had occurred during periods of unusual atmospheric conditions, specifically during heightened auroral activity, or when temperature inversions created thick fog across the region. The turning point in Chi's research came in August 2019, when he interviewed an elderly Inupiat elder who had worked as a maintenance technician at the DEW line stations during their operational years. The elder, speaking through a translator, shared traditional stories about the tall people who lived beneath the permafrost and emerged during specific astronomical alignments. According to these stories, the tall people were not spirits, but physical beings who had inhabited the region long before humans arrived, possessing knowledge of the doorways between worlds that existed in certain locations where the ice was particularly thin. The elder specifically mentioned the area around Point Barrow as one such place, describing how the original inhabitants would leave offerings at certain locations to maintain peaceful relations with these beings. What struck Chi was the similarity between these traditional accounts and certain elements of Navajo oral history, particularly stories about the Anasazi and their supposed connections to star people. Chi's investigation took a more personal turn on September 3, 2019, when he discovered a series of symbols carved into the permafrost outside his research facility in Kaktovik. The symbols were a combination of traditional Navajo constellations and geometric patterns that matched those described by Officer Yazzie in his report on the missing researcher. More disturbing was the discovery that the symbols had been carved with precision that would have required specialized tools in the frozen ground. Yet no footprints or other signs of human presence were visible in the surrounding area. Chi photographed the symbols and sent them to a colleague at the Navajo Nation Museum, who identified them as representing a specific ceremony related to star walking, a little-known practice mentioned in only the most obscure oral histories. The following night, Chi experienced something that would fundamentally alter his understanding of the phenomena he had been studying. Awakened at 2:17 a.m. by a low humming sound that seemed to emanate from beneath his research facility. When he went to investigate, he discovered that all electronic devices in the building, his laptop, camera equipment, and even his battery-powered recorder, were completely drained of power. The humming grew louder as he approached the window, where he saw what appeared to be auroral light, but behaving in ways that defied scientific explanation. Instead of the typical flowing curtains of light, these formed distinct geometric shapes, spirals, triangles, and what appeared to be humanoid figures that moved with deliberate purpose across the sky. As he watched, transfixed, he became aware of figures standing outside in the darkness, tall, slender silhouettes that seemed to phase in and out of visibility as the geometric lights pulsed overhead. Chi ended his research project abruptly, citing personal reasons in his withdrawal notice to the university. Before leaving Alaska, he submitted a preliminary report to his department chair that outlined the connections he had discovered between the various unexplained incidents and traditional knowledge from both Inupiat and Navajo cultures. The report, which was never formally published, suggested that certain locations in the Arctic might function as cultural portals, where ancient knowledge systems intersected with contemporary phenomena in ways that defied conventional scientific explanation. Chi returned to New Mexico, where he reportedly destroyed most of his research materials, keeping only a small journal of personal observations and a series of photographs that showed the strange symbols and unusual auroral formations he had documented. The university officially closed his research file in December 2019, noting that the project had been inconclusive due to insufficient data. No trace was ever found. In April 2020, as the world grappled with the emerging pandemic, a specialized team from the FBI's Evidence Response Team arrived in Fairbanks to assist with a cold case that had recently been reopened. The team, led by Special Agent in Charge Daniel Harjo, a member of the Choctaw Nation with extensive experience in cases involving Native American communities, had been tasked with re-examining the disappearance of Captain Roger Mitchell, the former Alaska State Troopers officer who had recruited several Navajo tribal police officers to positions in the North Slope Borough. Mitchell's case had been officially closed as voluntary disappearance after a year-long investigation yielded no leads. But new information had come to light that suggested a connection to several other unexplained incidents across the region. Harjo's team consisted of 6 agents with diverse expertise in forensic analysis, geology, anthropology, and electronic evidence recovery. Their assignment was to conduct a thorough search of Mitchell's remote cabin near Fairbanks, where he had reportedly been living in self-imposed isolation since his retirement from the Alaska State Troopers. The cabin, located on a 10-acre parcel of land surrounded by national forest, had been secured since Mitchell's disappearance, with only periodic checks by local law enforcement to ensure the property remained undisturbed. What the recovery team discovered during their 5-day investigation would raise more questions than answers, and would ultimately lead to the creation of a task force to investigate what appeared to be a pattern of interconnected phenomena across the Arctic region. The initial search of Mitchell's cabin revealed little of interest: personal belongings, standard household items, and a collection of books on Alaskan history and Native American cultures. It was in a small outbuilding used as a study that the team discovered the first anomalies, a series of maps covering one entire wall, with numerous locations across the North Slope Burrow connected by lines that formed spiral patterns. Many of these locations corresponded to the sites where unusual incidents had been reported: the abandoned whaling station, the Chandelar Shelf Listening Post, the Kaktovik Weather Station, and the DW Line Station at Point Barrow. More disturbing were the handwritten notes accompanying the maps, which referenced traditional knowledge from various native cultures, including specific ceremonies and astronomical alignments that Mitchell apparently believed were connected to the phenomena he had been investigating. The most significant discovery came on the third day of the search, when one of the forensic analysts discovered a false compartment beneath a floorboard in the study. Inside were several items that would become central to the renewed investigation: a collection of audio recordings on specialized high-capacity drives, a series of photographs showing unusual light formations and what appeared to be tall, slender figures in Arctic landscapes, and a detailed journal written in a code that combined English, Navajo, and astronomical symbols. The audio recordings, once decoded, contained what appeared to be recordings of the mysterious broadcasts that Sergeant Tso had documented, along with additional transmissions that had not been previously reported. The photographs, analyzed by experts at the FBI Crime Laboratory, were deemed authentic but unexplainable, showing figures and light formations that defied conventional understanding of physics and biology. Harjo's team made their most perplexing discovery on the final day of the search, when a ground-penetrating radar unit detected an anomaly beneath the cabin's foundation. Excavation revealed a small chamber constructed with techniques that appeared to combine modern engineering with traditional knowledge, containing a series of objects that appeared to be cultural artifacts from various Native American tribes, including the Navajo, Inupiat, and several other groups. These artifacts were arranged in specific patterns that corresponded to the star charts Mitchell had created, with particular emphasis on constellations that were visible only during specific times of the year in the Arctic region. At the center of this arrangement was a single object that appeared to be a communication device of unknown origin, constructed from materials that could not be identified by the FBI's laboratory analysts. The FBI's official report on the investigation, filed in August 2020, was heavily redacted before being shared with other law enforcement agencies. What little information was released suggested that Mitchell had been conducting a private investigation into phenomena that connected traditional Native knowledge with unexplained occurrences across the Arctic region. The report concluded that while no evidence of foul play had been discovered in Mitchell's disappearance, the unusual nature of his research materials warranted further investigation. A special task force was formed to examine potential connections between Mitchell's work and the various incidents involving former Navajo tribal police officers. But their findings have never been made public. Harjo was reportedly transferred to a different division shortly after submitting his report, and members of his original team have been reassigned to various positions across the country. The cabin and surrounding property were purchased by an anonymous buyer 6 months after the investigation concluded, with the new owner reportedly demolishing all structures and removing all evidence of previous occupation. No trace was ever found. The winter solstice of 2020 brought with it an unprecedented convergence of researchers, law enforcement officers, and government officials to the remote Dew Line Station at Point Barrow. The gathering, officially described as a joint training exercise on Arctic survival techniques, was in fact a carefully orchestrated investigation into the phenomena that had been documented across the North Slope Burrow over the previous 6 years. Led by Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a theoretical physicist from Los Alamos National Laboratory with expertise in quantum mechanics and dimensional theory, The team included specialists from various disciplines who had been quietly assembled to study what the government now referred to as Arctic Anomaly 2020 Alpha. What they would witness during the 3 weeks of the polar night would challenge not only their scientific understanding, but their conception of reality itself. The research team had been granted access to the abandoned DW line station under the guise of conducting environmental impact studies related to climate change. Their actual mission was to monitor the location during the period of maximum auroral activity that occurred around the winter solstice, when traditional knowledge from both Inupiat and Navajo cultures suggested that the doorways between worlds were most accessible. The station, which had been retrofitted with state-of-the-art monitoring equipment, served as both living quarters and laboratory for the 16 team members who had volunteered for the assignment. Among them was Officer James Tso, the nephew of Sergeant Linda Tso, who had recently transferred from the Navajo Tribal Police to the North Slope Borough Police Department, a placement that some later suggested was not coincidental. The first significant event occurred on December 18th, when the station's magnetometers detected unusual fluctuations in the Earth's magnetic field that corresponded precisely with the appearance of auroral formations, unlike any previously documented. Instead of the typical curtains and ribbons of light, these appeared as distinct geometric shapes, circles, triangles, and spirals that maintained their form for extended periods before morphing into new configurations. Dr. Rodriguez's team recorded these phenomena using specialized equipment designed to capture light beyond the visible spectrum, discovering that the formations contained wavelengths that should not have been naturally occurring in the upper atmosphere. More disturbing was the discovery that these wavelengths corresponded to those described in traditional Navajo stories about the light of the Star People, specific references that had been documented in Captain Mitchell's journal. The situation escalated on December 21st, the night of the winter solstice, when the research team detected what appeared to be structured signals emanating from beneath the permafrost approximately 1 mile from the station. These signals, which defied conventional analysis, contained mathematical patterns that suggested intelligence rather than natural phenomena. Officer Tso, who had been monitoring the perimeter, reported seeing movement in the darkness, tall, slender figures that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When he approached with his flashlight, the figures did not flee, but instead turned toward him, revealing faces that were humanoid but lacked discernible features in the way that humans understand them. Tso later described the encounter in his official report, stating that he felt not fear but a strange sense of recognition, as if he were seeing something that had always existed just beyond the edge of human perception. The climax of the incident occurred at 11:47 p.m. on December 21st, when all monitoring equipment at the station simultaneously registered an energy spike of unprecedented magnitude. The aurora overhead coalesced into a single, brilliant point of light that appeared to open like a portal or doorway, through which the research team could see what appeared to be another landscape, one with 2 moons in the sky and vegetation that glowed with its own internal luminescence. For approximately 3 minutes and 17 seconds, this portal remained open, during which time several of the tall figures were observed moving between the 2 worlds. Most of the research team was transfixed by the sight. But Dr. Rodriguez and Officer Tso both reported hearing voices speaking simultaneously in multiple languages, including Navajo and several dialects that linguists later identified as extinct Inupiat variations. The official report on what became known as the Arctic Circle incident was filed in March 2021 and remains one of the most heavily classified documents in the U.S. government's archives. What little information has been leaked suggests that the research team was debriefed for weeks following the incident, and that most have been reassigned to positions where their specialized knowledge can be monitored and controlled. Officer Tso reportedly resigned from the North Slope Borough Police Department 6 months after the incident. returning to the Navajo Nation where he now serves as an advisor to the Tribal Council on matters related to traditional knowledge and environmental protection. Dr. Rodriguez was reportedly promoted to a position with a classified government research program, and her published work on quantum mechanics has taken a distinctly philosophical turn in recent years. The DEW line station at Point Barrow was officially decommissioned and demolished in 2022, with all traces of the previous structures removed from the landscape. No trace was ever found. The American landscape remains vast and unknowable, particularly in the extreme environments where human presence remains minimal and nature operates according to its own ancient rhythms. The stories we have shared tonight, from the mysterious transmissions received by isolated officers to the unexplained phenomena documented by researchers, remind us that there are still places where the veil between worlds grows thin, where the boundaries of our understanding are tested by experiences that defy conventional explanation. What connects these disparate accounts is not proof of something supernatural, but rather the persistent suggestion that reality may be more complex and layered than our current scientific paradigms can accommodate. The pattern of Navajo officers experiencing these phenomena in the Arctic raises questions about cultural knowledge and perception that may never be fully answered. Traditional Native American understandings of the world have always included dimensions that Western science has struggled to measure or verify: concepts of interconnectedness, alternative ways of perceiving time and space, and the possibility that human consciousness might be capable of accessing realities beyond those immediately apparent to our senses. What we have documented tonight suggests that somewhere in the intersection of traditional knowledge and contemporary experience, there may be truths that await a more complete understanding. Silence often follows these encounters, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that cannot be adequately expressed in language. The officers, researchers, and officials who experience these phenomena frequently struggled to articulate what they had witnessed, falling back on metaphor and comparison to convey experiences that existed at the edge of comprehension. This struggle to communicate is itself significant, suggesting that what they encountered may challenge not only our scientific understanding, but the very structures of language and thought through which we make sense of reality. Memory becomes the repository for these experiences, held not in official reports or scientific papers, but in the stories told quietly among those who were there. The legacy of the Arctic incidents lives on in the lives of those who were touched by them. Officers who changed careers, researchers who shifted their focus, and families who carry the knowledge of what their loved ones experienced. These memories, like the permafrost that holds the history of the Arctic landscape, preserve fragments of something that may one day contribute to a more complete understanding of the world we inhabit. Absence of answers characterizes these cases more definitively than any specific explanation. What we have shared tonight are not solutions, but rather documentation of questions that remain open-ended, inviting contemplation rather than conclusion. The Alaska State Troopers' official statement that no credible evidence has been found suggests that our current methods of verification may be inadequate to the task of understanding phenomena that operate at the boundaries of human experience. Sometimes, the most honest response to mystery is not to force it into existing categories, but to acknowledge its resistance to explanation. If you or someone you know has a true story to share, leave it in the comments below. Thank you for watching Sleepless Campfire. Until next time, stay safe out there.